When I received the assignment of sky as my inspiration for the spring fling, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. I thought, clouds? Okay, maybe, but I just wasn't liking it. So then I realized I actually have the perfect inspiration for air. I have been flying since I was very young. My dad worked for an airline at the time, and so I never knew road trip. We always flew everywhere. And now I fly for my job. I teach, and I love traveling and flying. And I realize that I take the same picture everywhere I go because I am a window seat person and I am a window shade up person. So I have the perfect inspiration photo. I'm going to use this photo that was taken at my last trip to Hawaii as the inspiration for my project. So I'm going to show you how I turn a photo into a quilt pattern and then the quilt pattern into a quilt. So we'll work through all of the design process, including how I make the quilt pattern with EQ8, the program on my computer, and then I will pick out fabric colors, and then we'll make the actual quilt and you'll get to see the actual quilt in the end. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I've really turned from not so sure to excited about this project, and I am looking forward to seeing the end result. So I've imported the image into EQ8 and you can really just trace right over top of it. And then I like to have the photo next to it as well, just to reference, because as you can see, the EQ8 does a little bit of rendering. It kind of simplifies the photo, and so there's quite a bit of difference between the two. I actually like the lines in the sky here, so that if we want to do kind of a gradient, light to dark, they're kind of done for us. And then I'll definitely need it because this looks like land in the reference photo, but it's really ocean. It's just good to have that reference photo in front of us while we're working in EQ8. I like to think of foundation paper piecing as carving off a statue. You really start carving off the larger chunks first and make some good progress, and then you can kind of come in and do your fine tuning and detail work. But first we need to really get some large chunks carved off. A good point to start, this wing has some really nice straight lines, and I think that's going to be a really nice place to carve off a big chunk first. So let's start there. And I'm not really worried about like just complete accuracy, but I think we'll get the general idea just from essentially hinting at it. So I'm going to start carving off some of this land, and again, I'm not going to do every single little bit of that coast, you know, the ins and outs, and that's just a lot of work. I'm not doing that this time, but I will get the idea. I will hint at it. I will, you know, if it's curved, I will get some curves going. I don't want it just going to be completely blocky and boring, but we just don't need all of the detail that is here. Looking so far. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So it's almost like we could use these lines that we've created off of the engines actually as our sky gradient. almost look at it as a block. Oh, that's fun. Oh, I really like that. I like the shadows and the engines. We're gonna add some detail to this wing. I really like that there's a reflection on the wing, so we're gonna have to figure out that, but I really like that. I want to differentiate between sky and mountain and ocean. So let's give the ocean a tiny bit different color for now. Okay, so I think we'll actually get one more color out of our gradient once we add this wing. It'll just add an extra line in here that we can make use of. I really like this so far. So I'm going to finish up, and in the next section I'll show you the finished pattern, and then we'll choose our fabrics. Okay, so this is pretty much where I'm gonna stop with it. I really like the engines and the shadowing there. I might play around a little bit more with it later, but for now I'm really happy with that. I like most of the lines on the wing. Some of them will actually show up more in real life. So there's lines in here that I've included in the piecing, but that don't show up in the rendition, and I think it will come across really well in the piecing, and then we can use it in the quilting as well. But otherwise, I like the gradient in the skyline. I think for the land and the clouds, I might try to find the fabric that will convey clouds, or I might experiment with like bleaching some fabric. I don't know. I think it's worth a try. Or painting. I'm not sure yet, but I just don't think I'm going to get the result I want if I try and do clouds in the piecework. So we'll do that in post-production. So at this point is when I really start turning it into a pattern. So I have several things I need to work through, several pages I have to create. First of all, I have to break it up into sections, and so I'll do that manually because I've given EQ8 a lot of information, and at this point it's kind of overwhelmed. In a simpler block, it would have broken it down into sections for me, but I've just completely given it too much to work with. So I'm going to do it manually, but that's okay. And then I will create the assembly guide so that we know what order we need to sew the sections together in. And I'll do a couple other renderings just so that we have reference pages. We need a coloring page maybe. And so I'll do all of that in EQ8 with just the various settings. We have the pattern all complete now, and this is where it starts to get easy and I can really have some fun with it. The pattern takes a lot of technical detail and labeling and editing, and it's just not my favorite part. But now that we have the pattern done, I can start auditioning some fabrics and really see what I want to use in the actual quilt. So I have the finished pattern here, and right now it's mocked out in solids. Let's mock it up in some prints and just see what it looks like, see if we like it. I'm going to go in here and choose some new prints because I don't really like the ones that are just generically chosen. There's not a lot of variation. So I'm going to go choose some blues, and I'm just going to choose some random ones here. Actually, I don't really like those. Let's see if we can find some batiks, because I feel like prints, I don't want to do it in prints. If I'm going to do it in anything besides solids, it would be batiks. So let's just see what we can, oh, see there, that's better. But see, I'm not sure we're going to get the variety we need. And I need a lot of grays. Well, there's a couple there. So I'm just going to pick a bunch and we'll play with them. Let's see what we're looking like now. So the really cool thing with EQ8 is I can use the spray can tool and spray a color and it'll spray all of the pieces of that color. So for this dark blue, it'll spray everything that is dark blue. And then I'm going to step down my colors. Now, I might not have gotten enough blues, but I think this is going to be the lightest blue. We'll just start here. And then, I don't think that's the right shade. Let's go to our grays. I've got the light gray here. See, I'm just not loving that. It's just mottled. That's better. Let's work off of that one. I'm not falling in love with the prints or the batiks. Normally I love batiks, but I feel like this is such a realistic look that I really don't want to interrupt it with any prints. So I'm going to stick with solids. Let's go back to the original solids version. I really like that. So I'm going to use my color chart to pick out, I think 7 shades of blue and I think 4 shades of gray, but I have that all written out in the pattern. So I'll use the pattern to reference how many shades of the colors I need to pick out. I'll pick out my colors and then we'll get started sewing. I feel like the rendering of the pattern shows the lightest blue as darker than I actually want. So I'm going to start on this row, but I'm going to grab sky blue from the row below because I like how light a shade it is. Then I'll pick out all my other colors, land, water, grays, etc. And I'll write their color codes down so I don't forget what I've chosen. So these are my files where I keep all of my Robert Kaufman Kona solids. Every time I finish a legit kit, I have a lot of fabric left over and they're all organized by the color code that legit uses. So I can consistently file them by that color code and I just always have these fabrics on hand. I'm actually able to make this whole quilt with fabrics from this specific stash. So I use the color codes from the color chart that I just used and I can come to these files and pull the colors, and some of them I might not have enough of and then I can just choose the next closest color, or I might have to do some piecing within the pattern piece. We'll just see what I end up with in the end. But I really like that I can make good use of my leftover fabrics, especially the larger pieces. And I do a lot with solids. I'm just drawn to solids probably because I do so many legit kits, but I just like that I can use the solids. They're versatile. They're not one-sided, so I don't have to worry about right or wrong side, and that makes it really convenient for foundation paper piecing as well. These are the shades that I've chosen. I really like all of them except for the lighter colors. I feel like there's not enough difference between the 4 lightest shades, so I'm going to substitute a couple and play around with them until I get what I really like and am happy with the result in the end. Now we have all 40-something pages of the pattern printed out, and we need to paste them together because many of these pattern pieces span over several pattern pages. So I'm going to trim the corner off of 2 sides of the pattern so that I can line up the lines on each pattern. And I started out with glue. The glue was being a pain, so I swapped to tape at some point. But you just glue or tape the pattern pages together and make sure your lines stay straight. Take your time, and if something doesn't quite line up, you can reposition it. You have a little bit of work time with the glue, and then if you're using tape, it's the Scotch tape, so it'll come off pretty easily and you can reposition. So take your time and make sure everything stays nice and lined up and your lines are perfectly matched. There are quite a few large pieces to this pattern, so we just have to put them together before we can start sewing. And then I'll cut out the pattern pieces. Once everything's taped or glued together, you can cut them out roughly. I do not cut right on the seam allowance. Do not worry about being precise. The pattern comes with labels, so I'm going to use those to label my selection of blues and grays and all of my fabric so I can keep track of what is what. So the way I like to start cutting is just laying out all of my pattern pieces on top of the color that they will use. I like to do dark to light. So if a pattern piece calls for Sky 8 and Sky 7, I'll place it on the Sky 8. And then I'll cut all of the pattern pieces for Sky 8, and then I'll move them to Sky 7 if needed, or put them in the done pile. And I kind of work through all of the fabrics that way. And so I just get a bunch cut at the same time, and I cut everything out before I start sewing. And then we come to the good part, which is actually sewing this thing together. So if I'm just working through a bunch of pieces, I don't always press in between every single seam. Sometimes I just finger press, and especially on the smaller pieces, I don't need to be ironed every single time. But I just do kind of assembly line style. I won't even use a rotary cutter half the time. I just use scissors to trim off the extra. So if you've ever wanted to learn foundation paper piecing, I have a lot of tutorials and videos on my website and on YouTube. You can find me on any of the social media platforms by Cranky Kangaroo. So go find a tutorial, learn how to foundation paper piece, because it is my favorite technique. I will usually turn a traditional pattern into foundation paper piecing just to avoid traditional quilting. Sometimes in foundation paper piecing, you come to an odd angle that you struggle to get sewn correctly so that when you flip the fabric over, you're actually covering the pattern piece. So this last piece on this pattern here, it's not even an odd angle, but it's that my fabric does not match exactly the pattern piece. And so I want to make sure that I line everything up. So this is my trick for doing that. I will put the fabric on top of the pattern piece and then crease right on the sewing line. And then I can flip the fabric to the back of the pattern piece and line up the sewing line on the crease. You'll see me doing this several times with several different pattern pieces. I think if you've ever tried foundation paper piecing, you've had this problem where you flip your fabric open and it does not cover. This is a better example because that really is a weird angle. So just fold back right on that sewing line, give yourself a couple creases, and then I will also crease at the starting point so that I know exactly where on that fabric to place the pattern piece. And you just kind of have to peek behind it and line everything up. And then once you sew it, you know it's good to go because you've marked it before you sewed it. You can also use pins. So if you think you have it lined up, put a pin right on that sewing line, just like you're going to pretend to sew it. And that way you can flip your fabric before you sew, before you trim, and check to make sure everything lines up and everything is in the right position. Then you can remove your pins, sew, trim, iron, and you should be in the right position. On a lot of these pieces, you might notice that I'm using quite large pieces of fabric. There's a couple reasons for this. One, I'm pulling from what is essentially scraps in my stash. So if I just had a small piece that roughly fit the pattern, I'm just going to put it with a pattern and sew it and trim off the extra. I'm not worrying about really cutting it to the exact shape of that pattern size. And then two, I actually use my scraps, my cutoffs. So if you saw the Fall Grace Festival, you saw my project where I use up all of my scraps. And so I have a really fun project for that. And so I just don't worry about waste. The other thing too is these are Robert Kaufman Kona Salas. They're one of the very few OTEX certified fabrics. So you could even put them in your compost if you're just really worried about putting them in the trash. Put them in your compost. They'll deteriorate over time without adding harmful chemicals to your yard. So there's lots of ways to use up your scrap. And for me, time is money. I would much rather just throw the fabric onto the pattern and trim off the extra and not worry about how much waste I have. Once I have all of the fabric sewn onto the pattern pieces, I will trim them on the seam allowance. Now, one of the things I really like about the True Cut ruler is that you can work around pins because it's got this nice open grid to it. So I can just put the pin head in between the grids. And then instead of like with a regular acrylic ruler that would shift and slide and be very dangerous if you have pins on your fabric, this I can work around and really be able to still use pins to hold the fabric to the paper piece. Now, I do sometimes use tape. I'll just use the same Scotch tape that I use to put the pattern pages together. I'll use that in between the fabric and the paper. I'll double the tape over on itself, and that will hold the paper to the fabric as well. For the smaller pieces, I actually use a rotating cutting board, and this is nothing more than a cheap Lazy Susan, like what you would use in your pantry to organize your spices. And then I've glued a piece of wood and then a mat on top of it. I probably used like a scrap mat that was bad in some places, and I just cut it the size of the Lazy Susan. I just finished all my pieces and they're trimmed. So I get to put them together now. I'm so excited. I was really stressed about getting this done in time, and it is 3:30. I started sewing these pieces this morning and I'm done sewing them. So let's finish our quilt. When you're putting your sections together, there's a couple things to keep in mind. You can line them up just by matching the endpoints. Be careful with this because sometimes they can shift, or with these really sharp angles, sometimes it's deceptive, like where they're really supposed to line up. But as soon as I sew the seams, I will remove the paper from the seam allowance. I leave the paper on everywhere else. If it has like a label on it, a number, a letter, a section name, a color name, I will leave that paper on until the very end, but I will remove it from the seam allowances. And this makes ironing much easier because nothing will get caught underneath your seam allowances. So you can also use a pin and point method where you put a pin into one end point and up through the corresponding end point, and do that at both ends of the pattern pieces, and then pin right on that sewing line. That way you make sure that you're really getting your end points lined up and everything will match across that seam. And then again, remove paper from the seam allowances and give it a good press. I will try and press open if I can, but sometimes the fabric tells you it does not want to be pressed open. It wants to be pressed to one side or another. So listen to your fabric, and once you get all of your sections together, you can give it a good press and remove all of your paper then. I stayed up late last night to finish this, and I am so in love. Let me show you. I was so excited. I love it. I think the reflection turned out even better than I expected because I wasn't sure about the pink, but sometimes you just have to go with it. But I think that pink works really well there. The green, actually, I changed from my original choice because I didn't have enough of my original choice. So now I'm going to quilt it in part 3. It's time to quilt. And this is my favorite part because usually when I'm excited about quilting, it's because I've had lots of time to think about it and I've given my brain the time it needs to really figure out what I want to quilt, because we spend so much time fretting over what do I quilt on it and what color do I use. And so when I give my brain time to think and then I realize what I want to quilt and then I can be excited about it, I love that process. So I have had lots of time to think about what I want to quilt on this because I've procrastinated, so it's time to get it done. But I think I have it all planned out and I'm excited. So, in the clouds, I'm going to do this little free motion cloud-like shape, you know, swoopy and fun. And then in the water, I'll do a wave shape. And for the land, I'm going to do pebbles because I think it'll kind of look like treetops. So I'm going to do all of this free motion. And then for the actual wing, I think I'll just do a very few straight line quilting lines. And I might have to get creative. I bought the the quilt clips recently, and I'm still experimenting with them, but I'm thinking I can use these just to kind of put the quilt on the frame, like the whole quilt sandwich at the end, to reposition it because the wing is kind of diagonal, and so I really just want to be able to put the quilt on the frame with that wing lined up straight. So I'm going to experiment a little bit with that. Now, as far as thread color goes, if I have learned anything while quilting, it's that your thread color does not matter. I have quilted black on white and purple on green and all kinds of colors, and while it's fun and it might be fun to look at while you're quilting it, from the regular distance that you're going to look at the quilt thread just does not matter. It does not make the impact that you think it's going to. So I'm going to use gray because I think it'll blend in nicely, and I thought about changing colors at one point, but I don't really feel like it right now. So I'm going to use one color throughout, and I think the gray will blend nicely. And then the main thing that I want to make sure happens is I don't want like a weird color to be on the wings. So I don't want to use like a green on the wings, although I don't think it would even show. I just don't feel like changing colors. So I'm going to use gray throughout. So that's the plan. Now we need to choose backing. I remembered that I had cloud fabric. I mean, how perfect would that be? But I don't have enough. So I have this. Now this, I think, will be excellent. It's like the view from above, right? But let's look at a couple others just to make sure. Because I have these like city ads, like the old-fashioned ads. They're really cool. So that one's California themed. Oh, this one's a big panel. Alaska. I think I like the idea of using the big panel, but I think I'd have to add borders to it. This one's cool too. So if I had a Hawaii one, I'd be all over it. It doesn't really match Alaska. It doesn't really match California either. I think I'll just go with the streets. I think that's a nice option. I think it's beautiful. I think it matches the topic. So this is Grace, and previously I was quilting on the Juki that I stitched on, that I pieced the quilt together. I had her on this frame, and I used that for years. I loved her. She did really good work. She's a straight stitch only machine, and so she was fast. So that little 8-inch throat is what I did all of my quilts on, and I made it work. But you can't beat this. So I'm so excited. I've only done a couple quilts on her, so I'm still getting used to her. She's still getting used to me. We're learning a lot about each other along the way. So I did actually upgrade her because I bought the manual. So it's a Qnique 16X manual, but I did upgrade her to have the stitch regulation because I missed that. I had a stitch regulator attached to the Juki, and I couldn't just plug that one into this one. So I had to actually upgrade her display, which I've been really happy with so far. So I'm gonna get this loaded on the frame and then try and just enjoy the process and have fun with it. So I'm a pretty lazy quilter when it comes down to it, but there are certain things that I always do. I try and measure the width of the quilt as I go along so that I can keep that consistent and adjust as necessary. It's not until later in this process that I realize I have not, in fact, secured my backing to this uptake bar. I'll realize it later, and thankfully everything behaved and I didn't really have any trouble with it. I just plain forgot and I did not realize it until later. But let's take a look at some quilting. I'm just going to have fun. They're not going to end up being exactly what I had imagined, but it's okay. I still am really happy with the result in the end, and I actually got some really good practice in. I mean, that's really the whole point here, is that you practice and you get better, and how are you going to practice unless you just jump in and do it? So I'm really glad I did this, and it's really nice to practice with organic shapes because they're more forgiving, because you don't have to worry about straight lines and do my lines match up, and it's a cloud. A cloud can be anything, so have fun with it. And if you're worried about your quilting, do something organic. Clouds, pebbles, waves, those are great things to practice with. we need to practice before we do our actual quilting. In this case, I got to the part where I needed to put waves and I thought, what does a wave look like? So I got my erasable ink pen and just drew it real quick. And that kind of got it firm in my mind and reminded me what a wave looks like. And it's okay if my waves are not consistent, and they definitely are not. The first row, I went in one direction, and then coming back the other way, I thought, well, I want to keep my waves going in the same direction. So I did on the second row, but then the third row, I think I accidentally sent the waves in the opposite direction and I ended up liking it more. Now in the end, it's not going to show which way my waves go, and I know it's there, but it's not a big deal. But I got some good practice in again, and that's what matters. I'm just trying to get practice in and get better. Originally, I thought I would do some straight line quilting on the wing, but I honestly really like the way they kind of pop out, and it is just a wall hanging. It's too small to be anything else anyways, and so I don't have to quilt the wings, and I certainly don't want to add anything that would distract. I'm going to go with it for now. I can always add texture later if I want to, but for now I am really happy with this. I did the pebbles in the land, in the waves, in the water, and the clouds. And while they're not exactly what I had in mind, they worked out and I had fun doing them, and I think they're great. And when you look at it from even just 4 feet here, you really can't see the thread color. It really does not make as big of an impact as you would think. I love it so much, and I'm so glad I had the air inspiration that gave me the idea to use one of my favorite photos. So I am going to hang it on the wall here in my sewing room. It's not bound, but that's easy, so I'll take care of that later. But I love the quilting. I'm really happy with it. The only thing I might do in the future is I kind of want to add the look of an airplane window. So, you know, just that fuselage color
curve all around it, just kind of framing it in, and then maybe something 3D, almost like that shade handle, you know, just up here at the top, just to mimic the idea of actually looking out the window. But I can do that another time too. I will be back up in the air next month. I'm heading to Oklahoma for a Legit Kits retreat there. For all of my events and my upcoming classes, you can check crankykangaroo.com and click on the upcoming events tab. I will be back in Hawaii in July for several classes there. So come see me in Hawaii and you can get your own photo out the plane window. I will also be on a quilting cruise next July. So I have designed a quilt exclusively for the cruise. It's foundation paper piecing and it's designed so that you can choose your difficulty level. So if you've never done foundation paper piecing before, you can choose more of the beginner version, or if you're a pro and you just want a fun project, maybe even a challenge, you can choose the more complicated version. So all of that information is also at crankykangaroo.com, and then click on the Quilting Cruise tab. So thank you for quilting with me. Happy sewing.